Okay, now that we are recording these, as you might recall, last week I ended with this illustration that Frank used in Sunday school of Tim Tebow, who in college used the eye black under his eyes to promote John 3:16. They won the national title in 2008, and 94 million people Googled John 3:16 as a result. I found that. That was last week on Sunday. I was going to remind you of that, Frank, but so when he turned pro, exactly 3 years later, in Tebow's only playoff game, January 8th, 2012, the pros will not allow you to do this. So God took care of it, as Frank talked about this morning, and I talked about last week, which I'll remind Frank. Anyway, in the context of last week's message, I was so choked up I couldn't read these stats, and it occurred to me during the week, well, if someone's listening to this in the recording, they probably want to know what I was showing. So God took care of where Tim Tebow could not. Passing yards, 316. Yards per completion, 31.6. Time of possession, 31 minutes and 6 seconds. Television ratings, 31.6 million people. And as a result of this, the announcers noticed this at the end of the game. Tim Tebow's PR person noticed it and alerted Tim Tebow of it. So as a result of what God did with these statistics, 90 million more people Googled John 3:16. So for the binge listener, yes, for the binge listener, now that explains the illustration last week that I was a little choked up to share with you verbally. So forgive me for that. It's a good thing we're not on radio, right? It takes a lot of getting used to this. Okay, so let's get into our message this week. Last week we looked at the commission that Artaxerxes, the king of Persia, gave to Ezra for his ministry in Jerusalem. Ezra was in Babylon for the 80 years or so that after the first contingent went there, and he was called by God to go back there. And we're going to look at the start that Artaxerxes gave to Ezra for this very important mission. Remember, Artaxerxes is a polytheist. He didn't believe in the one true God alone. He believed in many gods, but he obviously believed in this God as part of his godly set. Well, let's look at what he gave to Ezra for this trip. Ample, in fact, all the financial backing he would need. He told the leaders in Jerusalem to give him whatever he needs. But in addition to that, or part of that, was 4 tons of silver. That was 100 talents of silver. That equals 4 tons. We showed a picture of that. If you had 4 tons of silver, it's about enough to make a solid silver automobile. All needs were to be filled by the king's treasury. Tax-free status for all 5,000 people who went with Ezra and his entourage. The authority to set up a judicial system. We've, as Kim highlighted during our prayer today, we have seen a lot about our judicial system this week. Well, Ezra had total authority to appoint judges, any number of judges he saw fit to appoint. That authority was given to him by Artaxerxes. And along with that, Ezra determined the punishment for anyone who broke any laws. That's what he was going there for, to firm up the laws of God. And that punishment ranged from banishment from the kingdom to death. Ezra had the power to enact any of those punishments. We should all get such a start, should we not? Artaxerxes was setting Ezra up for the ultimate success. This is how you do it. You give the person everything they need. Artaxerxes was continuing a tradition that was established by Cyrus and continued by Darius. All 3 of those kings provided the Jews with freedom to begin with. They were slaves in Babylon after Nebuchadnezzar conquered it. Fund them generously, not just give them money, fund them generously. Give them all that they need. Give them all the necessary authority they need to be successful. All 3 kings sent along with Jews that emigrated back to Jerusalem artifacts taken from Solomon's temple by Nebuchadnezzar. We'll study that a little bit today. All 3 kings trusted the Jewish contingent implicitly. And all three kings sought the favor of the God of Israel for both themselves and for their children. Commonalities of these three polytheist kings that is really impressive when you think about it. All due to the will of God, making all these things possible. We gathered from the events that we studied last week that Ezra and Artaxerxes had a strong, strong relationship. Ezra no doubt expressed to Artaxerxes what he needed for this very important mission, and apparently stressed to Artaxerxes that the rules were not being followed in Jerusalem. They needed someone to come and shore up their dedication to God through the laws of God. The mission was to recenter Jerusalem on the law of God instead of whatever they were doing, which we haven't been told at this point in the book. So today let's look at the folks Ezra brought with him and how he began to approach this very important assignment. We're going to look at Ezra 8, verses 1 through 23. Ezra 8, verses 1 through 23. Now these are the heads of their fathers' households, and the genealogical enrollment of those who went up with me from Babylon in the reign of King Artaxerxes. Now, verses 2 through 14 list the heads of the families Ezra brought along with him, which I won't read. The important thing to note is that 1,500 men are listed according to the tradition of the time. Their lineage is listed. And if you include women and children, you can surmise that the entourage equaled about 5,000 people. So 5,000 people were emigrating from Babylon back to Jerusalem, or to Jerusalem. If you compare the list, Ezra 2, 3 through 15, a list I also did not read, but if you compare the lists from chapter 8 and chapter 2, you'll see many relatives of the first settlers join them. And I think that'll make more sense why that was as we continue with today's lesson, as the Lord revealed it to me. So let's pick up with verse 15. Now we're going to go to Ezra 8:15. Now I assembled them at the river that runs to Ahava, where we camped for 3 days. And when I observed the people and the priests, I did not find any Levites there. So I sent for Eleazar, Ariel, Shemaiah, Elnathan, Jarib, Elnathan, another Elnathan, Nathan, Zechariah, and Meshullam, leading men, and for Joarib and a third Elnathan, teachers. I sent them to Iddo, the leading man at the place Cassiphia, and I told them what to say to Iddo and his brothers, the temple servants at the place Cassiphia, that is, to bring ministers to us for the house of our God. According to the good hand of our God upon us, they brought us a man of insight of the sons of Mali, the son of Levi, the son of Israel, namely Sherebiah, and his sons and brothers, 18 men, and Hashabiah and Jeshiah of the sons of Merari, with his brothers and their sons, 20 men. And 220 of the temple servants, whom David and the princes had given for the service of the Levites, all of them designated by name. Then I proclaimed a fast there at the river of Ahava, that we might humble ourselves before our God, to seek from him a safe journey for us, our little ones, and all our possessions. Excuse me. For I was ashamed to request from the king troops and horsemen to protect us from the enemy on the way, because we had said to the king, the hand of our God is favorably disposed to all those who seek him, but his power and his anger are against all those who forsake him. So we fasted and sought our God concerning this matter, and he listened to our entreaty. Okay, so what's happening here? Last week we saw Ezra's commission from Artaxerxes, and as the compiler of the book operates, we assume Ezra was already in Jerusalem because he speaks of that. It took him 4 months to get there, etc. We remember from a few weeks ago, Ezra 7 through 8, some of the sons of Israel and some of the priests and Levites, the singers, the gatekeepers, and the temple servants went up to Jerusalem in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes. He came to Jerusalem in the 5th month, which was in the 7th year of the king. So last week he was already in Jerusalem, but this week he's back in Babylon or just outside of Babylon, organizing his people, making sure he has the right people. So the compiler, again, is not tied to chronology. He's going back in time to help us study how Ezra made sure he had the right contingent to go to Jerusalem. He stops at a river running to a place called Al-Hava. Now we assume Al-Hava is near Babylon, but no one knows where Al-Hava is. They've been unable to excavate anything that tells them where Ahava is. So when he says he's running to a place along a river called Ahava, this artist depicts Ahava as being along the Euphrates, which ironically is probably the one river in all the world that Ahava could not be on, because Euphrates was considered at the time to be the main river, the big river, like the Mississippi in the United States. So if Ahava had been on the Euphrates, surely that would be clear. It would be like me saying, well, I'm going to start in Minnesota and go camp out in a place that ends in New Orleans. That's a 2,300-mile journey along the Mississippi River, and it could have been anywhere along that. Now, we can only assume that it's near Babylon for reasons that we'll get to. Okay, so what Ezra has done is get his contingent away from Babylon so that he cannot have those distractions that Babylon provided. Remember, all 5,000 people had been in Babylon all their lives. So there were many distractions there, and he obviously wanted to get them away from there so he could camp out and do what had to be done. He goes presumably a short distance from Babylon before he camps out for 3 days. And there makes sure they're ready to embark on this very important mission. And remember, what's he find? Of around the 5,000 people, not a single Levite has stepped up. Isn't that interesting? Fortunately, Ezra knew some, and he sent for them in Babylon Eleazar, Ariel, Shemaiah, Elnathan, Jerub, Elnathan, Nathan, Zechariah, Meshullam. These were leading men, along with Joareb and a third Elnathan, as I read. So these are Levites that he knew, and he recruited them. Now, it doesn't explain to us why there were no Levites in that original group of 5,000. That seems kind of unusual. Speculatively, the Levites in Babylon may have assumed there were plenty of priests in Jerusalem, so what am I going to do when I get there? I'm doing perfectly well here in Babylon, so I'm just going to stay here. Well, imagine spending your whole life somewhere, even if it's Babylon, an evil place, and someone comes to you and says, hey, how would you like to pack up everything that you've gathered all your life, walk 900 miles, carry some knives and forks and things, and resettle in a desolate Jerusalem? Well, no Levites took him up on that offer, not until he had to make a special request. Ezra sent for those he knew, and he sent them to Casaphia, where they'd find a man named Iddo, leader of temple servants, which Ezra also needed. We wonder why God only gave him 38 Levites and 220 temple servants. You'd think it would be the other way around. But that's what the numbers came to. Casaphia, incidentally, is another city we have no idea how to find. But again, we assume it's somewhere near Ahava and Babylon. Remember, they're going on a 4-month journey. They have to carry every provision that they're going to bring. So these delays are very risky, very costly, and very troublesome. So why the urgency to find Levites and temple servants when there were plenty where they were going, in Jerusalem? The answer is indicative of Ezra's dedication to God's law in every particular. This is a very important part, even though it seems kind of trivial if you think about it on the broad scale. This is a very important detail. Artaxerxes' commission of Ezra included some temple articles. Just to remind you, Ezra 7:19, also the utensils which are given to you for the service of the house of your God, deliver in full before the God of Jerusalem. So apparently There were other utensils in addition to those that we read about in Ezra 1:7, the first lesson on Ezra. Also, King Cyrus brought out the articles of the house of the Lord, apparently not all of them, which Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and put in the house of his gods. And Cyrus, king of Persia, had them brought out by the hand of Mithridath, the treasurer, and he counted them out to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah. And remember, I believe Sheshbazzar was Zerubbabel, who led the rebuilding effort. So you can see when these knives and forks and plates, which is what the utensils are, they were detailed back then, they don't seem like that big a deal, but they are. So much so that Ezra goes to a considerable amount of trouble to recruit the Levites and the temple servants to carry them properly from Babylon to Jerusalem. And here's the law that Ezra was following, Numbers 150. But you shall appoint the Levites over the tabernacle of the testimony and over all its furnishings and over all that belongs to it. They shall carry the tabernacle and all its furnishings, and they shall take care of it. They shall also camp around the tabernacle. So we can see that Ezra is not going to risk his entire mission by ignoring this small law for convenience. He's going to stop everything, delay the process for at least 3 days while they camped out, and make sure everything's done according to the law. Remember, Ezra is definitely the foremost expert on the law in Babylon at the time. That's why God has chosen him for this mission. He knew all of it, and he knew it well enough to be put in charge of all of Israel by King Artaxerxes. So step back and think about this for a minute. Ezra is directed by God to go to Jerusalem and use his vast knowledge of the law to help Jerusalem get back on track. That tells us Jerusalem is off track, although we don't know why at this point. And it needs God's help again, as he's often done, including by sending Haggai and Zechariah, the prophets, to tell them he wants them to rebuild the temple. Ezra gets 5,000 people together, has enough provisions for a 4-month, 900-mile walk for all of them, and he just stops it dead soon after it starts. And all of a sudden, he's got to retool. So he sets up camp and convinces some Levites to join them, and he finds them, just so he can assign them to care for some knives and forks. It must have made no sense to many of the 5,000. This is the level of effort Ezra is willing to go to for this very important mission Jerusalem for. Had he ignored it, it would have set the tone that he was willing to compromise on small things because it's too much trouble to meet all those requirements. Ezra had to show that he was not willing to compromise. How many would have said, oh, who cares? All it is we just need somebody who's willing to lift these things. I'm sure God will take care of us and not worry about it. Do I want to delay this journey? Do I want to tax our provisions? Do I want to put the whole mission, the 900-mile walk, at risk just so I can get some people to carry this stuff? Well, the fact of the matter is, if you're willing to compromise on little things, and here's the theme of today's message, you're going to be willing to compromise on bigger things and bigger things and bigger things. I think of people who get to the point where they're willing to rob a bank. Where do you think that comes from? Maybe it started with seeing someone drop a $50 bill and not telling them and just waiting until they left and then picking it up and keeping it. Maybe it started with cheating on taxes. Maybe it got to the point where they couldn't have a bank account because they had so many people to whom they owed money that anytime they put money in the bank, the government just takes it out. I know many people in that state. They have to keep their money under the mattress or the government will take it. So pretty soon, they're willing to rob a bank because anybody who can have a bank account is better off than they are, so I've got to even it out, social justice and all that sort of stuff. pretty soon, if you live this way, if you're willing to compromise, you'll lose everything. Let's look at Luke 16:10. I was doing a Bible study last night, and this perfect verse came up. He who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much. And he who is unrighteous in a little thing is unrighteous also in much. Isn't that the truth? Ezra articulates this in his way in verse 21. Ezra 8:21. Then I proclaimed a fast here at the river of Ahava, that we might humble ourselves before our God to seek from him a safe journey for us, our little ones, and all our possessions. So perhaps this is how he took care of the provision problem. He declared a fast, so we're not going to eat for 3 days. Or as we saw with Daniel, he just had a fast from tasty food, which I've done during my prostate days. At any rate, he declared a fast, and he gives the reason for the fast in verse 22, because he didn't want to ask for protection, because he'd already told Artaxerxes that God protects them. God provides everything. So by asking for protection, it would have been counter to that message he was trying to teach to Artaxerxes. Now we'll see that Nehemiah will accept that help when we get to Nehemiah. He asked for an armed guard, but Ezra did not feel comfortable doing that. He felt ashamed. He's experiencing what I think, although this isn't said in the text, a lack of rigor for the law, a lack of rigor that he was guilty of. Someone carried the utensils from Babylon to wherever they camped, and that was against the law. So he stopped everything and made sure that they were doing things the right way. He wanted to make sure everyone understood the spirit that lived within him. And he wanted each and every person on that contingent to have the same spirit. He was responsible now for 5,000 people and a 4-month journey. And he was going to be responsible for many, many, many more after that when they got to where they were going. Considering that, it seems like a lot less trouble, does it not, to stop and make sure you have people to carry knives and forks according to the law? And what about if it was just Ezra alone on the journey? Is it okay to lighten up? Is it okay to break a law here and there since no one's there with you, no one's listening, no one's watching? Absolutely not. And if anyone complained about the delay and the risks they were taking, good. That would give him another opportunity for them to understand the importance of what they were doing. It's also important to know that that entire caravan of 5,000 people would have been a sitting duck for the marauders and the criminals and everybody else that was populating the area at the time. Here you have several thousand people who'd lived in Babylon all their life, totally inexperienced with warfare, with defense, with fighting. They're carrying a fortune. They're led by a scholar, not a general. And the area, as I said, loaded with thieves. They were sitting ducks. And yet Ezra would not ask for protection, although Artaxerxes surely would have given it to him if he'd asked. That is faith. And everybody saw that Ezra was being faithful in that regard as well. And God answered it favorably. We know he got favorably. We know they got there safely. So, compromising on the little things. Where do we go and how do we illustrate today's message? Well, we're going to jump right to the horrible things. We saw what was described, probably in an understatement, a circus this week. It was a horrendous week in the news. I'm sure many of you were like Kim and me. We were overwhelmed by what was going on. It was a horrible week for Judge Kavanaugh. Some of his enemies, not really even his enemies, he was just a pawn in this whole thing. But those who didn't want him appointed to the bench brought forward several women to accuse who I believe was an innocent man, or is an innocent man, of sexual impropriety. Where along the line did these people who brought these women forward decide that that was the right thing to do? Remember, we're dealing with politicians. If you're willing to compromise on little things, you're going to be willing to compromise on big things. And I'll even add, you'll be blind to what you're doing when you get to that point where you're compromising on big things. You won't even see that it's a compromise. You'll think it's the right thing to do. Maybe it started with them accepting campaign contributions that were illegal. Maybe it started with accepting campaign contributions from people they were uncomfortable with because they didn't want to represent what those people represented and wanted them to do. Or maybe it started with them getting a friend a job who was totally unqualified. However it started, each and every one had gotten to the point where they decided it was okay to destroy a man's life and his family's life, totally tarnish his reputation, which Jesus calls murder in Matthew chapter 5. It's okay to murder this man to accomplish whatever you want to accomplish. Doesn't matter how many you hurt, as long as you're successful. Remember what Harry Reid said when he made up a lie about Mitt Romney. And in the end, all he had to say was, well, he lost, didn't he? Here's someone who's totally lost himself. He thought it was okay because he accomplished what he wanted to accomplish. Pursuing one agenda, no matter how many you hurt. See what centering on God does for us. I shudder to think how some pastors would have to deal with the people in their congregation if they preached this message. Because the people in the congregation of a liberal church might shout them down right there. It's a testimony to you that no one's shouting me down right now. Half the country believes this was the right thing to do. Plenty in many churches today have compromised because they face nothing worse than what we're facing. We're living offering to offering. God's providing. What do we have to complain about? He said he would, and he is. Pay attention to the little things, because if you don't, you won't pay attention to the big things. You will totally lose track of what's right and what's wrong. And that's what we're experiencing in this country today. And let's pray that that changes quickly. Dearest Lord and Heavenly Father, we're so grateful to be here to learn more about you, to be reminded of your law, to be reminded of what's right and what's wrong. You didn't make these rules arbitrarily. You didn't make the laws to make life difficult for us. You made them because you made us. You wired us. You made them because you know the way that we need to live to have the best joy, the best life, the best existence we can possibly have. You made your laws because you love us. And you gave us your Son, who died a horrible death so that we could be forgiven for those laws that we broke. Lord, what an amazing system you've set up. Not for your own good, but for anyone who's studied you and knows how much you love us, knows how much you want to spend eternity with us. That's the whole purpose of all this creation. They know that if you say it, that is the best possible thing for us. And we don't need to worry about disagreement or conflict or anything else. If we do what you tell us to do, we will have the best possible life. And we're so grateful, Lord, for that direction. In Jesus' name, amen.